Hello and welcome to the fourth part of this tutorial. We're jumping over to Photoshop. What do we have here? And let's just talk you through this. As you can see on the screen at the moment, we have the final design with all of its various layers on the right hand side here. Let's switch over to this file, which is the template file. So the reason we've got one of these is because generally when you're if you're working in a business environment, you tend to have a brand, and generally you have like a kind of style that you work to, and you've got layouts that you need to conform to for website use, that kind of stuff. And what that means is you probably have, for example, as you can see here, the text on the left, you've got a CTA, which is a call to action, which is just beneath that under here called more info, or whatever that's going to be. So as a designer, you need to kind of make sure that your design is complementing what's come before, and what kind of complements the brand really. So this is what we'll start off with. I'm not going to go through and actually show you all the workings of how we put this together, but I'll give you a brief rundown to give you the gist of it. So basically we've got as I've already mentioned, the contents on the left side and this part here. On the right hand side, we've got the design area. So this is where your design is going to sit, and ideally where we want to place the discs and then embellish it and make it look really cool. So you'll notice there's a background image as well. Excuse me. So the background image has been colorized, as it were, to match our brand colors. And in fact, if we turn on this layer here, this group, here are our brand colors. We've got all of the colors here that we've used in various places in this PSD. So we can refer to these as we go along and try different things with the colors and how they work or not work. So with that said, let's just have a quick rundown of how this background works. So if I turn this layer off, just turn this one off. If I turn this off, this is the background of the design. And what we've done here, what I've done is I've added a slight curve to this just to make it a little bit darker. And then I've converted it to black and white just to take out any color from that. I've added a color blending layer on top of that. And in fact, that should be the same color as this blue here, or this one over here, I believe. Or very close to it anyway. And on top of that, we've made it a lot darker. So if I turn that layer off, you can see how much brighter that is. Well, obviously that doesn't look good. You've got no contrast, you can't read the text, and so on. So we add this layer here just to darken the background, because the background is not really that important, to be fair. In fact, we could even say, well, let's have it as black color. That also looks pretty cool. But we won't. Let's just leave it on multiply and 85%. Give it more of a tint. These are the rings in the background. So all these are you can see they're called secondary rings. And these are just vector shapes. So you've got some circles that we've created with the circle tool here, the ellipse tool. And by combining a couple of ellipses, you can actually create these rings. So I'll just quickly show you how to do that. If I create a new layer and we create a circle here, and it happens to be orange for some reason, let's turn the stroke off. I wish that was off by default. That's quite annoying actually. So we have this ring, okay? Let's bring that up to the top so we can see what we're doing. Now we've got that ring. Now if we want to make just a very thin ring out of that, we can just duplicate this by holding down Alt and clicking on the layer and dragging it up. We've got a copy of that layer. You can also right click and just duplicate layer there. So we've got these two now, and if we select the top one and just make it smaller, so again I'm holding down the Alt key so that I keep it keep the proportions regular. If I let go of the Alt key, you can see it actually still keeps the shape, but now it's not from the center, it's from the bottom left corner. If I press Alt, it jumps to the center. So let's just do that. And if we select both of these layers now, and then right click and select merge shapes, you now have one layer with both of these circles on, right? Now if we switch over to this path selection tool, we can select the inner path that we just created there. Up at the top here, you've got some path options here. So we can do subtract front shape. And there you have it. We now have a ring. Obviously, you can just change the color of that. You can place that where you like and all sorts of cool things with it. So that's how we did those rings in the background. Very simple. Just by turning down the opacity, you get the effect, that kind of thing. Let's delete that. So that's what these are. That's what these rings are. Nothing too complicated. We've got a vignette just to sort of darken the background a little bit further. Again, this is done with a spherical shape, a round shape, and the fill is set to 0, so we don't get any of the fill on that layer. However, I've added a gradient overlay, a blending effect, a layer style technically, and all that is go back into here. So this is purely just a couple of colors there, and we've got the dark gray on either side there, but we've given it a opacity up to the halfway mark. So everything around here is invisible, and then it just fades off to the outer edge there. So that's quite simple as well. Now, you'll notice that all of these are actually vector shapes, which is something that I tend to do because at least that way, if they're non-destructive shapes, right? So these are all, vector based, they're not pixels. So if I were to rescale this design, it would maintain the crispness, it wouldn't lose any integrity, and you wouldn't start seeing any artifacts like blurred pixels and things like that. So it's a really handy way of keeping things non-destructive. So where you can, just try to work in either high resolution smart objects or using vector shapes where you can, including SVGs. Right, moving on, we've got the main ring here. And this one's, again, it's very straightforward, just a vector shape there with, well, in fact, there's no layer effects on that. I was playing around with drop shadows, didn't really like it, so I took that off. That's the main ring. In fact, I put the drop shadow on here, actually. There you go. Rather than putting it on the ring itself. So that's there. And this one here is the focus area. So that's got a vector shape, vector cylinder, circle mask on it applied. So if I disable this, it's just everywhere. So you can see everything within this group is everywhere, all over it. So we want to kind of lock it down to just this area. So that gives us this inner circle look, if you like. We've got another circle. There's a lot of circles in this one. And this one is the inner shadow. So again, a cylindrical shape. So I keep saying cylindrical, a spherical shape, a vector-based shape. And again, we've got a gradient overlay in the same fashion as the vignette to show the, as a drop shadow, basically. Very simple. Beneath that, we've got a color overlay. So that's just filling, adding a color, solid color fill. It doesn't really need a mask, but it's there anyway by default. Photoshop creates it when you create this layer. And beneath that, you'll notice we've got another copy of this image that we've got down here, which is the background image. And that one is for just inside this circle. And this one is much lighter than the one in the background because it forms part of the design. At least that's the theory anyway. And to make that look like this, we've obviously got the color overlay I referenced earlier. We've also got a curves adjustment just to make, again, just to pull it down a little bit. And we've got a black and white converter. You can see how that changes the colors there from many colors original back to our brand colors. So this is what this does. So that's the focus area, as I call it. And there's a group here called Your Design Here. And this is ideally where we want to place our design in this empty group. Above that, with just one other layer, is a noise texture. So if I zoom in just a little bit, you'll notice here you have some pixels you can see. Very small, obviously. Whether you can see this properly on the YouTube and video compression, I don't know, but it's there. And that's just a very subtle addition to the whole design, apart from the content and the CTA. That's kept clean. So this is just to affect the background and the design. And it just gives it and adds another layer of grittiness to it, and I just like that kind of look, really. That a slight bit of noise is good. Let's put that back to 100%. There we go. And what we're going to do now is the template. So generally a designer would start with a template or a version of the template. They can just, rather than starting from scratch every single time, you tend to have these templates that you take from another designer, or you've created one yourself, and you just reuse that and then adapt it to fit your task. So switching back to this one, this is the final one. So there are some changes here. Obviously the background is different, and the background's not that important, but in this context it's quite simple. We've got the discs, of course, and we've got a few other overlays and effects that we can throw on top just to jazz it up a little bit, make it a little bit more exciting and engaging for our customers, right? So let's do that, working off the template, now that we've had a look at that. So the first thing we want to do is drop in the discs. And just to be upfront, I will be referring back to this one because there's quite a lot going in here. As you can see, these are the design elements that I used to create the final piece. Now, yes, I could have done a lot more than this. You could do something different, of course. You don't have to follow this to the letter. You can do whatever you like with your design and make it look fantastic. It's just something that I've done a few times before, played around with a few different elements and overlays, and I found this one worked quite well. Something that just came to mind is part of the designer's task is to kind of understand where to draw the line. And I don't mean that literally as a joke. I mean, you can go overboard with adding too many effects to the point where you're kind of making a bit of a mess visually. So that's something that you have to be aware of as you add things to this. You don't want to add so much that it detracts from the main design element and has a nice balance with everything. So that's why I say, you could do more. I could do things very differently. Of course, we're all different and have different approaches. So see how you go, have a play around with it, and it's trial and error, really. So let's go through this now. So jumping back to our template and going over to this window where we have the render from Blender. That sounds quite funny. So this is the image that we rendered, right? It's got a transparent background, which is great. It's high res, actual size, you can see it's quite large, which is really good. So we're going to drag that into Photoshop and just release there. Press enter. And now we have this render that we can drop over this area here. So what I did was I wanted to drop this somewhere in the middle. So first of all, I want to scale it down. Let's put that back there and just make that smaller, something like that. And if I want to place this exactly in the middle of this circle, you can do a little trick. Just make a selection of any of these rings. Let's use this one. So if I hold down, I think it's Control, and then click this, I've now got a selection of that focus mask. And with this disc layer selected, I can press V on the keyboard or this icon in the top left, and then you get these little alignment markers at the very top here. If I click this one, that will align it left to right, and this one will align it top to bottom. That's now dead center of our selection. And we can just click away now and deselect that. So if we're happy with that placement and the size of that, we can kind of move on to the next stage. So trying to remember how exactly I came to this, I couldn't tell you, but I generally start with adding things like flares, bright spots, that kind of stuff. So in doing that, we used quite a few images. I'll just bring them up on screen. Now you can find these images online for free in some cases. Other times, as part of your business, you might actually have a subscription to, hopefully, Adobe Stock as part of your Adobe Creative Cloud subscription. You will get access to Adobe Stock, hopefully. And with that, you can download some high quality lens flare effects and sparkles and things like that. Very useful. So I've created a folder called Assets generally. I put everything in there. These are the ones that I downloaded. So in here you can see you've got Adobe free. So some of these here, in fact, all of these are free, and anyone can download these regardless of whether or not they have a subscription. So which is why I grabbed these. And some of these are really cool. So I didn't use all of them, of course, but I saw them and thought, why not grab these? Here I found some assets which need attribution, and that means I've got to give credit back to the artist or designer, either by form of some link or something. So the website will tell you that as you go along. And this one was off a website called freepik. That's pik.com, freepik.com. And there's some really cool stuff you can find on there. And to give you an example of this one, you can see we've got some sort of lens flare image here. And finally, we've got another one here, which is, I didn't use it in the end. Again, you as a designer, you play around with things, right? You try different things. And at one point I had an idea of maybe these like lightning bolts are, touching the discs and maybe touching the rim of this white one. So I tried that and I didn't really like it. It just looked a bit too messy. I wasn't really feeling it with that. So I took that out and tried something else. So let's go back to our images. And finally, we have some other ones here, which are from Pixabay, always another good website. So I initially tried the clouds one as a background, and it kind of worked, but I just felt it was missing something, so I didn't use that in the end. Also, I found this Milky Way one, which was quite nice. Again, I tried this. I didn't feel as though it really worked for this particular design, so I didn't use it. And then I don't know why I just fancied this one. The nice crystal shapes, the gems. It's quite generic, and it's got some interesting lines in it. So I gave that a go, and that seemed to work quite well. So that's what you can see in the background there, although I have blurred it out there so I don't get as much focus on it. And if I turn off the discs, that's actually there in the background, in that circle, the focus ring, with the overlays on top. So that's how I use that. Let's add a flare where perhaps here is where I kind of focused in on, because that's quite bright. It's probably pure white there, which is not ideal, but it's fine. So I had a look around and managed to find some shapes there to use for that. Drag and drop these, because by doing that, you now have smart objects, right? You don't have just flat pixels. You double click it to edit this. So this is quite high res. You can see there, it's 16.7% magnification. So that's quite a large image, which is pretty cool. So we've got that in here now. Let's just select these layers and put them into our design folder so we can turn that on and off as we please. So with that here, obviously we don't want it to look like this. So what do? Well, let's switch it over to screen. And that will give us this. And what screen will do is it will just take all the bright areas of your image and make those visible. Of course, keep that, but it will just make all of the dark areas invisible. So we end up with this really cool effect. Now, I've just noticed you can see some clipping here on the edge, and that means this, if I double click that, this ray of light here has gone over the edge on this side and this side and at the top and the bottom. So we don't want that. We need to feather this out and hide that seam. So let's put this in place first, and let's scale it down. Something like that. That's fine. And we do have that clipping, as I mentioned there. You can see it there and on this side. So the quick fix for that is with this layer selected, click down here and add a mask. And you've got this white mask, which is show everything. And we can click on the brush, select the soft brush, and make that a little bit smaller. And let's just brush away, making sure we've got black here as our color. On that layer mask, let's just brush out this edge here at the top and on the right, perhaps a little bit around there, like that. So if I hold down Alt and click the mask, we can now look at the mask, and you can see I've almost done it correctly. If I just paint in the gaps that I've left behind there, just to make sure we've got everything. And I think that will do. So is that actually black? It looks like grey. No, it's black. Okay, so clicking back onto our image, we can see that there. So that's pretty good. Let's just place it here. And you can see how that kind of gives it another layer of excitement, I guess. Interest. Let's make that a little bit bigger. So that's a good start. Let's go with that. We can always tweak these later on, so don't worry if it's not quite right, or you... What I tend to find is that as you add things, you change things, right? You think, oh, well, that's too big. That doesn't look right. And while it worked before, suddenly it doesn't look so good. So you can, these are the things that you tweak as you go along. So referring back to this, we've also got some other overlays here as well. So that's the first one. Another one that I quite like is, there's no particular order, by the way. You have to add these just as you go along. You get a feel for it. Is adding some sort of bokeh look or feel, or even dust particles. Sometimes you get this kind of out of focus blobs, if you like. And that's the one here. Again, this is an Adobe free image, as you can see there. So let's jump over to that. Grab our image, which I think was this one here. So let's just drag that and drop it in again. And the same as before, we want to just put it in the background. Put that to screen. And now we have these blobs all over the place, which look pretty cool. So what I did was I scaled this up probably a little bit, brought it into the bottom right hand corner. And the reason I'm focusing on the bottom right hand corner is because we don't really want to intrude in the content area, right? If you were to start bleeding into this area, you may end up, confusing that copy or making it a little bit messy. So a lot of the times I will add a mask and then paint in a feathered transition. I don't need these elements here, just to keep this clean. Sometimes you get these little dots everywhere that you don't want, the hot pixels, if you like. So by making the brush bigger, you can feather that out quite nicely, like so. And let's leave it at that for now. And then we can turn this down. It's fine like this. I think I turned it down in the end to somewhere around maybe 70%, something like that. So that gives it a little bit of heat as well. You notice the color there is kind of orangey, right? And if you remember back in Blender, we added this kind of yellow light just to give it a bit more interest and a bit more drama, I guess. So this could almost be, there's something off the screen here outside of the design that's providing this light, the shields, and this is the same color or similar color. So it kind of helps to, drive that illusion home, as it were. So that kind of makes sense. So let's leave it at that for now. I mean, you could play around with this and add things like, some more color to this, or play around with the hue saturation and get some interesting effects. So if we move this to the side, which I can't do, we can clip this just to this layer by holding down the Alt key and clicking between them, and you get this little downwards box arrow thing. We click that, and this will only affect that layer now, not the whole canvas. So if we double click this and maybe change the saturation, you can see that our saturation is down to 0. So it effectively becomes grayscale. Takes all the color out. So that's obviously not what we want. We can bring that back to 0. And you can play around with the brightness of that and things like that. Just bear in mind it may introduce some clipping if we haven't masked, the areas that we need to mask and so forth. So I won't be using that in this instance, so I'll delete that. So that's good. What else can we do? How about some bloom and glow? Because that's something that you always get with light, okay, in the real world, and it looks really cool. Gives it a bit more depth. So you can see that I've got that there, just around where those sparkles are. So let's go back to our downloaded assets and have a look at what we've got we can use for that. So we've used that one and this one. This one's quite nice. I thought it was interesting. So, oops, let's just load that into Photoshop. If I drag it into here, you can see you've got this kind of really nice lens effect. And you've got those lovely colors, those rainbow colors as well. So I used that and plonked it right there, generally. And again, screen, let's try that. It's very subtle, so you can barely see the colors there, but they're there. And in fact, if they're too subtle, what we can do is we can just replicate that layer maybe 2 or 3 times on top of each other, and then that would just magnify that effect for us. So I think I did that in the original. So if I select it with this layer selected, I'm actually just checking to see if there's any clipping going on anywhere. I don't think there is. So we'll just duplicate this layer. And look what happens when we click OK on here. Just keep an eye on this area here. And you see suddenly you can see the colors a lot more vibrant and strong, which is really nice. I like that effect. So you could just leave it at that, or you could add another layer, obviously get it much stronger. Unfortunately, we're getting quite a hot highlight here, which is almost kind of bleeding too much into the design. So I think we can either, if you like that, you can either make it, tone down the strength of that layer just to give it a bit more, or if you feel that this is adding too much brightness in any particular way, like all the way out here, just add some mask into this. And I think what I did was I added a mask here, and I didn't want the highlight in the middle to be there. So add a mask, black color, and just paint that out. You see, just like that. And now we can retain the lower bright spot without oversaturating that area and making it really hot. So we can duplicate that layer again now, and it affects everything else but this area, which is really nice. We also got these nice kind of rings going out, light beams going out as well. So we'll keep that in. It may be a little bit strong. Again, it's subjective, right? Every designer's got an eye for different things. So maybe we don't do that. That doesn't make much difference if we move this this layer around. So as you go along, just play around with the layer stack here, because sometimes where this is in the layer stack can affect other layers above it or below it. So you might find that this one needs to be at the top, or it might need to be at the bottom, and so on and so forth. So as I said, play around with it. So that's looking really cool. Flip back to the other one now, and you'll notice probably the strongest thing you notice here, apart from this area here, is these flare things. I've also just noticed that I think I feathered a lot of these. Yeah, I did. Yeah, I feathered a lot of these light rays from that kind of rainbow effect there. So let's do that here as well. So again, with these masks here on these ones, we just select that mask, go into our brush again, make the brush larger, get a nice soft edge. I'm just going to push away some of these light rays here. In fact, this clips are there. You can see, I don't know if you can see that, just there, it's clipped. So that's not good. So keep an eye out for things like that. Switching back to the brush with the mask selected. Let's just brush away some of this like that. Remember, you may not always see the effect because you've got 2 layers there. So let's switch to the other layer, switch that one off, and do the same thing. You can suddenly see that that's now much less than it was before. Bring the other layer back. I can still see a bit of clip in there, so maybe it's this one. Try that one again. And it could act this one as well, isn't it? Of course. So let's add a mask to this one and just brush that away. There we go. That's worked beautifully now. Awesome. Okay, so going back to what we said earlier, we've got these lovely kind of fiery flare things, or sparks, or whatever you want to call them. Let's save our work again. You never know. Get a good habit. So these flare things I really like. I've been using something from Adobe stock for a while now that are very similar to these, but I didn't do that in this instance. I actually created this myself. I didn't really want to do that because if you have an Adobe stock subscription, by all means find something that you can use. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. Thinking about time versus value. How much time should I spend creating these things myself as opposed to just downloading one from Adobe stock and or any other source and using them for your design. What I did was I created this one myself, and it might seem a little bit kind of complicated, but it really wasn't that bad. If I can find it, there we go. I called it Energy Bolt. So I'm not going to get into this too deeply, but it's just a bunch of brush strokes and things like that. Nothing too radical, really. So we started off with painting these layers here. So there's some blobby stuff there. Here's a streak in the middle there. Here's another streak. So you just paint these and then just add some masks into them and fade them out. And then before you know it, just keep adding layer upon layer, adding the detail, adding the flare at the end. And then as you go up, add a bit of color, and then you have this. So I brought that into Photoshop, and you'll notice this one isn't actually straight, it's bent. So how do we do that? Well, distortion, right? You've got perspective and you've got distort and warp in Photoshop. So that's what I did. So let's do that. Let's use distort or warp. I can't remember which one I used. Let's try warp and see what happens. Okay, this was the one I think it was. Yeah, you can see that kind of warps things and does all sorts of clever things. We've got a kind of consistent line there we can work with now. So let's make this a little bit smaller. Get the effect we want. So like this, I can get it here on the dark background basically. So let's bring that in some more. Maybe make it larger. Something like that. That looks pretty cool. So quite simply, just duplicate that layer again. I sometimes actually leave two layers on top of each other because this one might be in the foreground, so I want it to be stronger than, say, one in the background. Just duplicate the layer, will give you that double strength, and then you can play around with the opacity of that layer to control the strength of that. So let's make that a little bit up to there or something. Now let's copy the original layer again and place it somewhere else now. So to add a bit of interest, and when you're thinking about, like, those fireworks that go around and spin round like a disc, then they fire off at different angles. That's what I'm thinking of here, because we've got the circular disc spinning, and these are kind of sparking off these, kind of playing off that motion. So by rotating these, you start to get a bit more motion in your design, I feel. So let's make that smaller. Keep rotating it, place it, and that looks pretty good. Again, spend more time on your design, but this gives you the general idea how that looks. Let's leave that there. So we've got these two interacting a little bit there. This one's okay. So we've got this now, and when we're looking at this, if I make this really small, you notice we've got a strong bright area down the bottom. So it feels as though something needs to balance that at the top. So looking at this line that goes, I guess, kind of like this direction. We've got a line this way, of course, and we could have a line going this way with this bright spot, the disc, and then up here. So what I'm going to do is copy this layer again and move it to the upper portion, rotate it round. And you can see that firework example, analogy that I mentioned earlier. You get this kind of rotation feel going, right? Which really helps to sell the idea, really. Yep, that's not bad. I'm happy with that. Let's leave it there. Yeah, it looks pretty cool. I like that. You get this nice kind of line there as well. So, I mean, yeah, you can do this all day long, right? You can add different sizes of these. You can put them in different places. You can even add them to the other discs. So you might think, well, why not add one? Oops. Let's add one of these maybe over here, right? It's quite cool as well. Doesn't have to be perfect. Whatever you think. That could be in the background because that disk is a little bit further away than this one. So you could put that there. And you get this flow happening now. So that could work quite well. But I'll leave that to your discretion. As I mentioned earlier, you need to be careful you don't go too far and you know, flood the design with too many effects, because at the end you kind of lose the main focus really. So I'm going to remove that for now. One thing I will do actually is with these discs, I'm going to go back to this for a second, and I'm going to add a curves adjustment layer to this. And again, you don't want it to affect everything underneath this layer. You want it to affect just the discs, right? So you can click on this. You can see you can create a clipping mask by selecting this, as such, or you can hold down the Alt key and then click between the two layers, and that will give you the same effect. And what this will do is affect this layer only. And if we just do that, you can see there what's happening. So I'm pulling down the shadows on the left side. These are the blacks in the bottom left corner. In the top right, you have the white, the peaks. So everywhere in between is the grayscales and the colors. So we can, raise and lower that curve. And I want it a bit more punchy, a bit more strong. So I'll bring down the dark area first a little bit, and tweak it in a second. And then by clicking on the curve, we can add another point. You can see here I'm pushing up the highlights and the lighter areas, and then bringing down the darker areas. And what that would do is it would create a stronger contrast. And to illustrate that, if I turn this on and off, you can see how much stronger this looks compared to the original one. So you can make these adjustments to your liking, of course. Like I say, everyone's different. Everyone's got a different eye for design. Do what looks good to you. And yeah, that's great. Is there anything missing from this? Is there anything that we can add to it to balance it out a little bit more, to add more depth perhaps? And actually there is one more thing we can add to this. And I did it on this layer, I believe, is to add a little bit of a drop shadow. And the reason I did that is because we have this white circle and it touches certain parts of the design, which is fine. You can leave it like this. I wanted a little bit more separation from the background. Rather than black, let's select this blue. And we have this now, but it's quite light, it's quite bright, right? So we can either click and drag this down till we get a very dark blue, somewhere around there. And let's set it to 100% so we can see the effect. You can see as I size up the shadow, the effect is happening on there, on the design, which is cool. But what I will do is make that, say, 10 pixels only, and turn this down to 20%. And the reason I've done that is because I picked up a little tip from, I can't remember who it was, on a YouTube video about Photoshop blending effects, where instead of adding just one drop shadow effect, add multiple and stack them. So you get a much more realistic, perhaps not in this case, but you get a better shadow because it's more gradual, it's nicer in its final look. So what I do is I add one at 20 and then 10, and if you duplicate this, which I've done as you can see here before, in fact I'll delete these actually, and then we can just do that properly. I'll select all of these other ones one by one, delete them. What we're going to do now is keep the opacity at 20, that's fine, but increase the size, double the size or triple it every time you add another layer. So let's make this say 30. And that shadow will be a little bit stronger now. We won't see it just yet, but we add another one. And this one's now 30. And we'll make that, well, ideally 60, because we've doubled it, right? Let's do 60. And that might be a little bit soft. We'll come back to that. Let's add one more and make that 90. And that might actually be too big. So let's go back to this make that 20, 30, and 40. So we go in increments of 10. And we'll add one more finally, 50 at the end. So with OK on that, we do have a drop shadow. You can see that there, barely. It might be a little bit too subtle. Again, I leave that up to you and to your discretion, to what you feel works. That's actually not bad. But what I will do is, on the last one, I'm going to increase that to, I don't know, 70. So I'm looking down here as I increase the value to see what the reaction is on the design. Obviously, I can just put it to 100%. Let's try 70, 75. Let's go with that. And then one below that, let's knock it up to 40. Let's do that. Yeah, so now you've got a more obvious shadow. It's not like solid black, but it's there. So it gives you a little bit more depth. Let's save our work. And switching back to our previous final design, as it were. There are some differences I've noticed actually. That you notice here, the light rays are much softer than in this version. These are quite strong actually, they're quite ugly. So you know, by all means, spend a bit more time tidying this up and softening that. So let's bring that down a little bit. Something like that. And in fact, what we can also do is add a little bit of blur to that. 20 pixels, of course, is a bit too much. So let's try 2. Not bad. Gives it a bit soft. It's a bit softer. Yeah, let's go for that. I don't mind that. And let's talk about the background. So this is fine. It's just the placeholder background, right? So we don't really need that. It doesn't really play a part in this design. Okay. So we have this render in the background. So as I mentioned earlier, we do have some downloads that I grabbed, and I ended up liking this one, with the gems one from Pixabay. So I downloaded that. I grabbed the high-res version. It's over 5,000 pixels. So we grab that, drag and drop it into our project. And with that layer selected, we can scale this up now. And you can see I've got the stretching again. So I'm going to hold down Shift, bring that larger. So it covers the whole canvas. And now you can just play around with other, you know, do you like it there? Do you like it here? I don't really like this. It's too wishy-washy, a bit too soft. You really want some contrast here in the background, so you get some nice legibility on the text. So I'm going to bring that up to the top where the darker part of that image is. You could scale that up further if you wanted to. So holding down the Shift key, you can scale that up a bit more. Bring that down to get more of that dark area in this upper left corner. Let's leave it there. That will do. So the background obviously plays a role in this, but it's not a main role. Okay, the main aspect is here. So what I ended up doing is adding a Gaussian blur again, Gaussian to this background image, because it became quite distracting with the pixels and the lines and everything. So you can add it here again, of course, but I've already got it on a previous layer, and that's blurring it by 5 pixels. So we can click and drag this and drop it onto our new layer, and we can delete the old layer now. We don't need that. And you can see it's softened that background quite nicely. Maybe push the image out a little bit more so we don't get any of that blur bleeding into the canvas. So I'm going to pull that out a little bit more. Oops. Something like that. And that also helps to add a bit more depth. Because as we know, things in the distance are more blurred. Thinking about photography now, if you focus on the foreground, the background will be blurred to give it that nice depth look and feel. So this is really nice. That image works quite well. And if we kept the image actually as we had originally, it still works fine. And in fact, I think the curves or the black and white adjustment layer here has made it lighter. So in fact, I'm going to turn that off. I don't want that because it's made it too light. The curves one is fine. We can play around with that some more. So I could just do, bring it down some more, which I'm actually liking more than the original. So I can bring that down some more. And it really helps to make these pop, right? It's really nice contrast with the text. The CTA is really clear. I like to use the navigator icon here, so which is window, and that will just show you a little thumbnail of your image. And I use that a lot because you can instantly see, as a whole, anything that stands out and shouldn't be there. You can kind of get a feel for the balance of the image, the composition, the contrast. And that brings me into a main point, really, when we're talking about design in general. We're looking for things like contrast and silhouettes. You want a person looking at your design to be able to immediately identify what they're looking at, what they should be looking at, and why it's like that, right? So, what's the message you want to give to this person? What should I be looking at? And from that, I can see this quite easily and it's quite strong. And then I can see this as well. The background is subdued. We don't need to be focusing on the background. We don't want our customers to be focusing on the background. That's there just for creative purposes. For me, that kind of works well. With that said, the vignette could probably be a little bit stronger, especially in this corner. But if I increase the strength of this, I will increase it everywhere. And I don't want to do that. So what I would do instead, again, this would depend on the image you put in the background, right? Because if you put a darker image or an image that hasn't got as many bright areas as this one has down here, you won't get that. You get a different look and feel completely. What I would do is add another layer here, and I will add not a gradient box. I could do a gradient fill, but I'm going to add another box and just drop it in. Let's make this box a bit darker in this area. So first of all, I'm going to get rid of this blue color because I don't want it to think that this is a color adjustment. I just want to make it black so that I know that it's just a blank box. And I will turn off the radius. We don't want, radial corners as cool as they look. At the 0. We've just got a box now, right? So we don't want the box contents itself, so we can turn down the fill to 0. We obviously don't want this fiery hot stuff here, so let's click on this and remove these, and we can use a dark blue again. Let's go for something like that. This is going to be very dark blue, so we want to try and make it somewhere in the middle between black and blue and a very dark shade, something like that. And then by clicking anywhere else with that one as the last click, we can get a copy of that, get rid of that, click and drag it off. And then we can just play around with these now. So that's 100% opacity. This one is 100% as well. So you can see it's a solid block. So which end are we going to feather out? This one here. So hopefully it's that one. No, it's that edge. So let's click on that. Click on this one and reduce that to 0. Now you have this feathered effect going on. And again, I've just noticed by default, Photoshop adds a stroke to your vector shapes. Again, I find that quite annoying. I wish that was 0 off by default. Maybe I can save that, I don't know. Anyway, that gives us a nice dark shading in that corner, right? So it's pretty much solid there, it fades off. And you could just extend that out if you so desired. We can bring that down beneath these layers and we can draw that even further. And it's doing this now because we have that. We did have that ticked actually somewhere, but we don't want that. We just want to drag it out to the side. So we can hold down. We can press Shift now to distort it. So we can hold down Shift and click and drag. And if we let go, it would then update the gradient. So if we press Enter, it got a little bit darker there, and that's looking pretty cool. So let's rename that layer. Let's call it background shading. If I can type, There we go. And that's a good point as well. You'll notice I've given everything names here, right? So I like to call my groups, obviously give them a label, but also give them uppercase. And then everything within the group is lowercase. So, you know, BG for background. This one's, I didn't write rings. I just put down, you know, the number of rings and then the percentage of the opacity at the top there. So I've got a visual clue and guide as to what I did with those rings. And also just to help other designers in the team, right? Because if someone's going to take this PSD, it might be a new starter in your team. They may not be aware of how does that work. And if everything's just called layer 500, layer 600, they're not going to, you know, they're going to have to spend a lot more time figuring out what does this layer do? What does that layer do? So if you give things names, again, vignette for the vignette and giving it the value, the hex value on the layer name, just helps somebody understand a little bit more about how this is put together, right? With that done, I think it's looking really great. If we compare the two that I did before and after, I actually prefer this one. Although this is probably a little bit small than I would have liked. And you can see that when I switch between the two, like so. And you can also notice that the second version that we've just gone through is a lot stronger visually. I really like this darker area here. So as I said, these are things that you can play around with as you go along. Sometimes you start out with a certain vision in mind, but as you come to realize, it didn't quite work out the way you thought it would. So you make these micro adjustments as you go along, and you end up with something that you're much happier with. And I think this is the case here. So I really like that. There's one thing that I haven't touched on actually, and I kind of forgot earlier on, was the background again. And if I turn off the design just for a second, do you remember we said we have another background in this area here? All that is a duplication of this layer and dropped into this focus area, this focus ring here. So let's do that. Let's drop this in because we want that to be continuous. There's a continuous flow of the background image to this image here. So if I click this, hold down the Alt key and drag it to here, we now have the same image applied. And I'll delete this one. There we go. And we've got this one in here now. Now we could leave that as, with the Gaussian blur on it. And that would be fine, but I'm just going to see what happens if we turn this off. And you can actually see that the gems, of course, as they are in the original image. If we bring back our design, obviously this is covering up a lot of the backgrounds. You literally cannot see much of that at all. So it probably won't make much of a difference whether you have the smart filters turned on or off. It might be actually that you have to keep this like that. You can't add a Gaussian blur to the background because that is the key area of design. So if that kind of strict brand restriction is in place, obviously you're not going to add a smart filter and then blur it out because it would be inconsistent, right, with anything else. So if you imagine this was on a website and you have this kind of carousel effect where it scrolls through different offers or something like that, if one of them had a Gaussian blur on it, then the next one didn't, it might be a little bit jarring. Some people may notice that and think, well, why has that one got, motion blur, Gaussian blur, and this one hasn't? What's going on there? So that could be lack of consistency. So, make a decision and stick with it, and see it through your designs. In this example, I kind of like it without the Gaussian blur because that's how it was originally, and I want to be consistent. So I will remove that and just delete that. And we get this nice kind of gritty background. Again, you don't really know what it is. You can't really tell. But in this case, it doesn't really matter, right? Because it's not the primary focus. The focus is the discs. That's what we want to be looking at. So with that said, thanks for watching. Thanks for joining me today. As they say, smash that like button. Consider subscribing if you like this kind of content. Thanks for watching. Bye now.